My mother took my sister to Paris 7 times, before my sister turned 18. I know it was 7 because I counted them from the doorway of our shared bedroom, counted the suitcases being packed, the matching luggage tags my mother ordered from a catalog, the particular shade of excitement on my sister's face that I came to associate with my own remaining behind. 7 trips. Evenson. Springs when the house got quieter and I learned to make my own meals and told myself I preferred it that way. I was never invited. Not once. Not with an explanation I could hold on to, not with a promise of next time, easy. Not with anything that acknowledged the asymmetry as real, Eb. My mother would say goodbye to me at the door, with a kiss on the forehead, and a $20 bill on the kitchen counter. And the name of a neighbor I could call if anything went wrong. Then she would leave, and I would sit in the quiet house and eat cereal for dinner, and tell myself the story children usually tell themselves when the alternative is unbearable. It doesn't mean what I think it means. In those same years, the same years of the Paris trips, the catalog luggage tags, the $20 on the counter, my mother took me to the food bank on the 3rd Saturday of every month. We drove there in the old Subaru with the cracked dashboard, and we stood in line with a canvas bag, and we brought home what they gave us: canned beans, boxed pasta, sometimes a block of government cheese so large it lasted 3 weeks. I carried the bag. I was good at carrying things. What I did not understand, what I arranged my entire childhood around not understanding, because understanding it felt like a floor I could not afford to fall through, was how both of these things were simultaneously true. The Paris trips, the food bank, my sister, me, the same mother, the same house, the same family. I did not understand it until I was 33 years old, sitting at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, reading a diary I had never been meant to read, written in handwriting I had known my entire life. Stay with me. I want to tell you this carefully, because it deserves care, and because I spent a long time not having language for it. Subscribe if you're new. And if you have ever stood in the doorway while someone else's suitcase got packed, this is for you. My name is Renee. I am 35 years old. I am a social worker in Baltimore, which is either the most predictable career for a person with my history or the most intentional. And I have stopped trying to determine which. I work with families in crisis. I am good at it, I am told that I have a particular ability to see what people are not saying, to find the thing underneath the thing, to hold complexity without requiring it to resolve into something clean. I learned this skill at home. You learn what you practice, and I practiced it from the time I was old enough to notice that my life and my sister's life were happening in 2 different registers, at 2 different volumes, with 2 different sets of available resources. I grew up in a small city in upstate New York. My mother's name is Valerie. She was a medical transcriptionist who worked from home, typing physician's notes at a desk in the corner of the living room, with headphones that made her unreachable for hours at a time. She was intelligent and precise, and capable of great warmth, and she directed that warmth with an unevenness I spent my childhood measuring without fully acknowledging what I was measuring. My sister's name is Brianna. She is 3 years older than me, long-limbed and graceful, and possessed of the particular confidence of a person who has always been the subject of a story, rather than the witness to it. I loved her plainly, and without complication as a small child. The complication came later, slowly, as I became old enough to understand that we were in different stories entirely. Wearing the same family as a setting, the food bank was not a secret. My mother did not frame it as shameful, or hide it from our neighbors, or require silence about it. We went, we carried the bag, we came home. There was a matter-of-factness to it that I have come to recognize in my work as a coping mechanism, the deployment of normalcy as a protective structure. If we act as if this is ordinary, it becomes ordinary. It becomes survivable. What was not ordinary, what no amount of matter-of-factness could normalize for me, was the Paris trips. I understood, even at 8 years old, that Paris was not the food bank. I understood that these two facts occupied the same financial universe, and that they did not cohere. If we were a family that stood in a food bank line on the third Saturday of every month, we were not a family that flew to Paris. The math did not work. Even at 8, I had a precise and unforgiving relationship with math. When I asked my mother, once, at 9 years old, because even then I knew there was a limit to how many times you could ask before asking became something else. She said that the Paris trips were possible because of Brianna's grandmother, on her father's side, to them, who contributed to them. She said it simply, as a fact, and moved on, and I filed it in the category of explanations that answer the question, without answering the question. I did not ask again. I carried the canvas bag. I ate the canned beans. I watched Brianna come home from Paris with small gifts that smelled like somewhere else. My father was not in my life. He left when I was 2, not dramatically, not with conflict, just the quiet departure of a man who had decided that fatherhood was not the life he had intended. I have no memory of him and very few feelings about him, which is itself a kind of feeling. What I understood growing up was that my sister Brianna had a different father. She was 3 years older than me, which meant she predated my parents' relationship. Her father was someone my mother had been involved with before my father, a man named Leonard, who lived in Connecticut and sent Brianna birthday cards with money in them, and, apparently, funded international travel. This was the explanation I had been given. Leonard's family. Brianna's grandmother on Leonard's side. I accepted it. I had accepted it for 24 years, and then my mother had a stroke. She was 61. It was a Thursday in October. The kind of day that doesn't announce itself as important. Gray and ordinary. Leaves down, the light already giving up by 4 in the afternoon. She was at her desk with her headphones on when it happened. A neighbor who had a spare key found her an hour later. She survived. She is alive, which is the central fact, and the one I return to when the rest of the story becomes difficult to hold. She survived with moderate deficits, some word-finding difficulty, reduced mobility on her left side, a fatigue that arrives without warning and takes her down for hours. I drove from Baltimore to upstate New York in 4 hours and 20 minutes. I am not going to tell you that I wasn't afraid, because I was afraid in a way that had nothing to do with our history, and everything to do with the simple fact of her. For all the asymmetry and all the years of carrying the canvas bag, she was my mother, and the call had said stroke, and I drove. I stayed for 3 weeks. I managed her discharge from the hospital, coordinated her home care, reorganized her house for accessibility, and did the thing that people with my professional training do in crisis. I made lists, I made the systems. I became, as I have always been in this family, the person who holds things together while holding my own feelings in a separate container to be processed later. On the 8th night, I couldn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, I went downstairs to make tea, and I passed my mother's desk, and on the desk was a wooden box I had seen my entire childhood. The box had a small brass lock. The key was in the pencil cup beside it. It had always been in the pencil cup. My mother was precise about many things, but she had a particular blind spot about keys. She kept every key near the thing it unlocked, because she lived alone and was not afraid of the people in her life, and because there are things we leave accessible that we believe no one will choose to see. I stood in front of the desk for a long time. Then I opened the box. There were 7 diaries inside. Small, cloth-covered notebooks, the kind sold at bookshops, spanning from the year before Brianna born to approximately 4 years ago. My mother's handwriting, neat and slightly right-slanted, the same handwriting seen on grocery lists and birthday cards, and school permission slips my entire life. I did not read them sequentially. Eats me. I am a social worker. I am trained to look for the thing underneath the thing. And so I looked for the earliest reference I could find to the arrangement I had never fully understood. I moved through the notebooks carefully. The way you move through a space that belongs to someone else, aware that I was somewhere I had not been invited. I found what I was looking for in the third notebook. The year was the year I was 4 years old. I will not quote it directly. These were my mother's private words, and they are hers. And even now, even with everything I know, they are hers. Gibalda. But I will tell you what they contained, because what they contained is why I am here, and why this story exists, and why I spent 8 years believing the problem was me, even. Leonard, Brianna's father, had not funded the Paris trips as a generosity, he had funded them as a condition. When Leonard and my mother separated, before I was born, Gibimi, they had reached a agreement, not a legal one, not mediated, not documented in any courthouse, about his involvement in Brianna's life. Leonard wanted access to his daughter, Gipton. My mother wanted financial support that the legal system, she had apparently calculated, might not reliably provide, from a man with Leonard's resources for concealment. They had negotiated, privately, a structure, Gida. Leonard would contribute a significant monthly sum, more than child support would have mandated, in exchange for guaranteed access, no legal proceedings, and specific, experiential investments in Brianna's life that Leonard could participate in or fund. The Paris trips were Leonard's requirement. He was a man who valued cultural experience. This is how my mother described him in her diary, in language that was precise and not entirely without bitterness. And he had insisted that part of his contribution go toward what he called Brianna's formation, travel, museums, the particular education of a child who sees the world. My mother had agreed. She had agreed because the money was necessary. And Leonard held the leverage, and she was a woman alone, with a child, and a medical transcription job, and a cracked dashboard on the Subaru. She had agreed, and then I was born. And the agreement did not change. The money was for Brianna. The Paris trips were for Brianna. The formation was for Brianna. Leonard's contribution did not extend to me. I was not his child, they. I was not his concern. I was not in the agreement and the food bank. The third Saturday of every month, the canvas bag, the government cheese, was where my portion of the family's budget actually lived. Gibbon. My mother had been running two economic realities simultaneously for my entire childhood. Brianna's reality, funded partly by Leonard's structured contribution, and my reality, Gibug, funded by a medical transcription salary that was not by itself sufficient. She had managed both without explaining either. Geeking. She had taken Brianna to Paris and me to the food bank, and she had kept the diary locked in a box on her desk, with the key in the pencil cup. I sat at my mother's desk until 5 in the morning. I am a social worker, Ghibli. I have sat with people in the worst moments of their lives, and I have learned to locate, in those moments, a steadiness that does not require me to have answers in order to be present. I am good at that steadiness, Ghibli. At 5 in the morning, in my mother's living room, in the glow of the desk lamp she had always used for late work, I did not feel steady, Gibi. I felt the particular disorientation of a person who has been living in a building and has just learned that several of its walls were not structural, that the shape she thought she inhabited was different from the shape that was actually there. I felt angry. I want to say that clearly because I think women are often expected to move quickly through anger toward understanding, and I am not going to perform that speed. I was angry, Gia. I had been a child who stood in a food bank line on the third Saturday of every month while my sister went to Paris, and the explanation I had been given, Leonard's family, Keen, Brianna's grandmother, was a compression of the truth that had protected everyone except me. I had been told enough to stop asking questions. I had not been told enough to understand. There is a specific anger that belongs to that experience. I sat with it until 5 in the morning, and then I made tea, and I watched the October sky go from black to gray to the thin early light. That means the night is over, and I made a list, because I always make lists, of what I knew, what I needed to understand, and what I wanted to say. I could not talk to my mother immediately. Her word finding was compromised and her fatigue was significant, and the conversations available to us in those weeks were necessarily limited. Logistics, comfort, the management of her recovery. I was her daughter and her caregiver, and I held the diary's contents in a separate container, and I did my job. I stayed 3 weeks. I drove back to Baltimore on a Sunday morning with the windows down, even though it was cold. Because I needed the air. I called Brianna from the road. Brianna and I had a functional relationship. Warm at the surface, careful underneath, the relationship of two people who love each other and have always sensed, without naming it, that something in their shared history requires navigation. She lived in Boston. She worked in marketing, She was the person my mother called first for most things, which was a data point I had always logged without annotating. I told her I needed to talk. I told her it was about the family, and it was important. I did not tell her I had read the diary. I told her I had found some things out, and I needed her to help me understand what she knew. What she knew, as it turned out, was most of it. Brianna had known about Leonard's agreement since she was 19. Had been told by my mother as part of a larger conversation about money and family structure. When Brianna had pressed for information, I had apparently never thought to press for. She had known that the Paris trips were connected to Leonard's contribution. She had known, in broad terms, that the financial arrangements in our household were not symmetrical. She had not known about the food bank, either. Not as a policy, not as a monthly reality. She knew we were not wealthy, but she had not known the specific texture of my portion of that unwealthiness while she was in Paris. She had not known. And I believed her, because I am trained to assess credibility, and because I know my sister, and because what I saw on the other end of that phone call was a person encountering information that was genuinely new and genuinely difficult, and not doing what a person does when they are constructing a response to something they already knew. He was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Renee, the food bank." Not a question. The way you repeat a thing back when you are trying to make it real. I said the third Saturday, every month. I carried the bag, he said, while I was in Paris. I said, while you were in Paris. The conversation with my mother happened 6 months after the stroke, when her cognition had stabilized enough for complex exchange, and when I had processed enough of my own material to arrive at the conversation I wanted to have, rather than the one my rawest self would have produced. I drove up on a Saturday. We sat in her living room, which I had reorganized for her mobility, in chairs that faced each other. I had not told her I had read the diary. I wanted to see what she would tell me if I simply asked. I said, "Mom, I need to understand the arrangement with Leonard, the full arrangement. I need you to tell me what it actually was." She looked at me for a long time. My mother's word finding was better than it had been in October, but still required more time, and I waited. "I am good at waiting," she told me. Slowly with pauses, sometimes with the right word arriving late, and sometimes not arriving at all, and being replaced by a gesture or a look that I had learned, in 6 months of her recovery, to interpret. She told me about Leonard, and the negotiation, and the contribution, and the trips. She told me the money had been necessary in a way that I, not having been an adult alone with a child in those years, might not fully comprehend. She told me she had done what she could with what was available. She did not tell me about the third Saturday. She did not name the food bank. I said, "I know about the food bank." She closed her eyes. I said, "I know about the canvas bag. I know about the government cheese. I know that I was doing that while Brianna was in Paris, and I know that you never told me why." She opened her eyes. They were wet. My mother is not a person who cries easily, and I have seen her cry perhaps 4 times in my life, and each time it has landed on me as something heavy, because she does not deploy it lightly. She said, with the careful deliberateness of a woman choosing words from a reduced supply, "I didn't know how to explain it to a child. And then you were not a child anymore, and it felt too late." I said, It wasn't too late, Cupie. It never became too late until you decided it had. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not guilt exactly, something older than guilt, the expression of a person who has carried a structural failure for so long that they have ceased to distinguish it from the structure itself. I want to tell you what the diary told me that my mother did not, because the diary was fuller than the conversations, and more honest in the way that private writing is honest, not curated for the listener, not managed for the relationship, you think, but true in the way a person is true when they believe no one is reading. My mother had known, from the time I was small, that the arrangement was unfair to me. She had written about it. Not frequently, not in the agonized way of a person in active crisis, but in the matter-of-fact way of someone documenting a problem they have decided they cannot solve. Evil. She wrote that Leonard's money was not negotiable, that the alternative to the arrangement was no money. And no money meant losing the house, either. And losing the house meant both of her daughters, in a situation worse than the one they were in. That she told herself I was resilient, that I was adaptable, that I would be fine. She used that word frequently. Fine. I had been fine. I am fine. But I have been a social worker long enough to know that fine is what children become when they have no other available option. Fine is a coping strategy, not an outcome. Fine is what you build out of cereals for dinner, and $20 on the counter, and the particular skill of not needing what you're not going to receive. My mother had watched me build that, and had told herself it was strength. It was strength. It was also something she had required of me, and she had required it without my consent. And the strength and the requirement are both true, and neither cancels the other. She also wrote about the lock. There is an entry, I am not going to quote it, in which she writes about the box and what she keeps in it and why. She writes that the diary is the only place where she does not manage the story. That everywhere else, with Brianna, with neighbors, with the face she presents to the world, she maintains the version that is survivable. The diary is where she allows the other version to exist. She writes, Renee will understand someday. She is the one who will understand. I sat with that for a long time. The assumption that understanding was sufficient, that being understood was a substitute for being told, that someday, either be some. By some unspecified mechanism, I would arrive at comprehension without ever having been offered the information. She had trusted me with an understanding. She had never given me the material to construct. Bettine. Brianna came to Baltimore in February. She drove down on a Saturday morning, and we sat in my apartment and talked until it was dark, and then ordered food and talked until it was late. It was the longest conversation we had ever had. Eat me, which is a sentence I find both true and sad in roughly equal measure. That a conversation available to us our entire lives had required a locked diary and a stroke to begin. She asked me what it had been like. Not in a general way, specifically. She asked me to tell her what the third Saturdays were like, what the house was like when she was gone, what I had felt watching the suitcases. Eugene, I told her. All of it. Not to hurt her. She had not designed this structure, but because she had asked for the specific truth, and the specific truth was the only kind worth offering, she cried. Brianna is a person who cries more easily than my mother does, which is not a character flaw, and I sat with her in the way I sit with people in my work, present, steady, healy, not trying to resolve the feeling before it has finished being felt. When she was done, she said, I want to give you something. I know it doesn't fix it. But I need to do something with my hands. Eating. I did not understand what she meant until 3 weeks later, when a check arrived in the mail. $30,000. In the memo line, she had written, 7 trips to Paris, interest included. I held that check for a long time before I deposited it, not because of the amount, though the amount was significant, but because of the accounting of it, the specificity. 7 trips, interest. She had done the math and she had owned it, and she had converted the reckoning into something tangible. I deposited it. I cried when I deposited it. in the parking lot of the bank, in my car. Not from grief exactly, Keepney. From something more like the physical sensation of being seen by someone who did not have to look. My mother and I are in the slow, non-linear work of rebuilding. I visit monthly, Gibi. Some visits are warm and functional, and end with me feeling something I can only call hope. Some are hard. She has days when her frustration at her own limitations surfaces as something that resembles the old management, the old withholding. And I have to remind myself that the stroke changed things, and also that some things predate the stroke and require a different accounting. I have not told her I read the diary. I have decided, after considerable deliberation, that she does not need that information. She told me what she needed to tell me in the living room conversation, and the diary was hers. And the things I know from it that she did not offer voluntarily are things I am processing in my own space without requiring her to know I have them. Geber. This is a decision I have made as a grown woman with clinical training and a specific relationship with privacy. I am at peace with it. What I have told her is this: that I needed her to name the inequality when I was a child, and she didn't. And that the absence of naming it did not make it absent, it made it ambient, it made it the water I swam in. Yeah. It made it the explanation I reached for every time I felt like less. I told her that I had spent years trying to identify the flaw in myself that produced the asymmetry, and that the flaw was not in me, and that she could have told me so at any point, and she didn't, and that I was working, with considerable effort, on what to do with that. She nodded. She said, with the careful precision of a woman choosing from a reduced available vocabulary, "I was wrong to let you carry that." 5 words. Incomplete, Ini. The way acknowledgement from parents is often incomplete, but genuine in the specific way of her, the matter-of-fact deployment of truth without drama, the directness underneath the management. The most her possible version of what I needed, I received it. Not as enough because it was not enough. As real because it was real. Here is what I do now, every day, in a job that requires me to see what families are not saying. I look for the children who are carrying bags, not canvas bags, though sometimes those too. The children who have calibrated their needs downward to match the available supply. The children who have become, as my mother said of me, fine. The children who stand in doorways and count suitcases and construct alternative explanations and do not ask after the first time, because they have already understood that asking will not produce the answer they need. I look for them because I know what they look like from the outside. Competent, adaptable, independent, strong. And I know what they feel like from the inside. I know the specific interior labor of being the child who is not the priority and knowing it and not being given the language to say so. I find them and I sit with them, and I say the thing that was not said to me. I see the bag. I know it's heavy. It is not yours to carry alone. This is the work. This is what I do with what was done. I want to say something directly to the person who grew up in the doorway. You were not imagining it. The Paris trips were real. The food bank was real. The $20 on the counter was real. The suitcase you watched being packed, and the quiet house, and the cereal for dinner, and the story you told yourself to make it survivable. All of it was real, and none of it was a verdict on your worth. The explanation, if you ever find it, will probably be complicated. It will probably involve adults making decisions from a position of limited options and compromised information and their own wounds, because that is how families produce their inequalities, not usually from malice, but from the accumulated bad arithmetic of people trying to survive their own lives, whilst also, inadequately, trying to raise yours. The complication does not erase the harm. Both things are true. Both things will always be true. The explanation does not balance the ledger. It just lets you see where the missing entries were. Giba. You were not the missing entry. You were never the explanation for your own undervaluing. You were a child in a structure that had been built before you arrived. And you carried the bag because you were there, and you were strong, and no one thought to relieve you of it. You can put the bag down now. Not because the past has changed, because you have, and you get to decide what you carry forward. I am 35 years old. Eat me. I have an apartment in Baltimore, with a window that faces the street and a reading chair I bought at a flea market, and a life that I built from the savings account of my own determination. I have a sister who drove to Baltimore in February and stayed until it was dark and sent a check with 7 trips to Paris, interest included in the memo line. I have a mother who is learning, slowly and with effort, to speak from the unmanaged version of herself. I have a canvas bag I kept. I don't know exactly why I kept it. It lives in the back of my coat closet, and I have not used it for groceries in many years. Sometimes I see it and feel nothing. Sometimes I see it and feel the third Saturday, as specifically as if it were last week. The line, the block of cheese, you veil. The practiced matter-of-factness of a mother making something survivable. I keep it because it is part of the true account. Because I do not want to revise the record. Because I was that child, and she deserves to not be erased in the editing. And because someday, I think, it will just be a bag if you're here. Share this with someone who stood in a doorway. Leave a comment. I read everyone, and some of them have made me feel less alone in ways I did not expect to need. And if you have ever stood in a food bank line while trying to understand a world that seemed to have a different set of rules for the person standing next to you, you understood exactly right. The rules were different, and you deserve to know why.